Harry Stonehill was the man who bought the 1961 presidential election with explosive consequences. Harry Stonehill, I can't go into all the details, it's a wonderful story. Born Harry Steinberg, a Polish Jew in Chicago, he travels to the Philippines in the Second World War and sticks around and sees a business opportunity selling chocolate bars and cigarettes taken out of the A rations that were left over from the US military. And then he recognizes an opportunity and he smuggles Virginia tobacco into the country because it's a better strain of tobacco than the domestic variants that had been used to create cigars. And he creates a business empire out of this. Amazing story. He's truly an amazing man. I may sound like I have a certain begrudging admiration for him. He was corrupt as hell. When Time magazine wrote a story on Harry Stonehill, they said Harry Stonehill resembles the sort of character that the late Sidney Greenstreet used to play in the Warner Brothers beaded curtain thrillers. So think the Maltese Falcon, something like that. I'm going to keep going with movie references. Harry Stonehill was a larger than life carpetbagger crook, okay? And he established a business empire. And the local elite hated him because who is this upstart GI, right? Who now encroaches on our turf. And the American community hated him. You know, that's not how we do it. We stay at the Army Navy Club, we go to the US Embassy, we don't. There are all sorts of terrible phrases they used to use for this. The one that's most common is go native. It's a horrible phrase, but that is how they talked about Harry Stonehill, right? So he has a number of enemies, but he's gotten quite wealthy. Among his friends, by the way, is Stan Lee, the Marvel Comics guy. He has to make a cameo everywhere. Here's his cameo. Stan Lee said that Harry Stonehill was the greatest guy. Apparently they were GI buddies. At any rate, Harry Stonehill needs political influence, and in the 1961 presidential election, it's a three-way race. Diosdado Macapagal, vice president, is running for president. Carlos Garcia, whom the Americans do not like, current president, is running for re-election. And Rogelio de la Rosa, a movie star turned senator and brother-in-law of Macapagal, is running for office. You had to know that the Macapagal family table was having some uncomfortable conversations as Rogelio de la Rosa was acting as a spoiler in the presidential election and threatening to undermine Macapagal's election. Harry Stonehill goes to Macapagal and says, and we know this now based on declassified documents from the US Embassy, as well as from court transcripts from 2011, which I worked through very carefully. Harry Stonehill goes to Macapagal and says, look, if you allow me to appoint 3 cabinet members and ensure that no foreign tobacco ever comes into this country to compete with my tobacco, I can buy the election. And Macapagal says, okay. And Harry Stonehill goes to Rogelio de la Rosa 1 week before the election and says, look, here's $1 million, drop out. And Rogelio de la Rosa says the next day, I've decided I need to spend some time with my family. And Macapagal becomes president. What's the relevance of this story? Well, it's a good story. But on top of that, Harry Stonehill had an accountant. Similarly, foreign extraction. It's a complicated story. I won't go into all the details. Nonetheless, he's not a Filipino. He comes to the Philippines, works as Harry Stonehill's accountant, and the accountant saw an opportunity. I think that a certain social type attacks a certain social type, and the accountant said, you give me a significant share of corporate holdings, or I'm going to tell everyone what you just did. And Harry Stonehill dragged his accountant by the ankles to the 12th floor of their building and held him over the balcony and said, if you tell anyone, I'll let you go. And he said, I won't tell anyone. And Harry Stonehill then let him go in a different sense, allowed him to leave. And he went straight to the US Embassy. And he said, Harry Stonehill bought the election. The US Embassy was horrified because they wanted Macapagal to be president. And they knew that if this story broke, Garcia would dispute the results and Macapagal would not be president. The CIA wrote about Macapagal in the lead up to the election. Macapagal is so pro-American, it's a source of some embarrassment to us. This was the man they wanted in office. And as a result of this, they decided Harry Stonehill has to be removed from the Philippines, but we have to do it quietly. So they contacted incoming Justice Secretary, a man named Pepe Diokno. And the CIA told Pepe Diokno, you cannot tell your boss, you cannot tell Macapagal, he may not know about this, but we need you to wiretap Harry Stonehill's offices, we need you to carry out a raid, the CIA will assist you in this, and we need you to arrest him. And Diokno says, I need to be sure that the US government is behind this. I need to meet with JFK. And they said, you can't meet with JFK. And he said, well, okay, can I meet with RFK? And they're like, yeah, RFK is actually flying to negotiate with Sukarno right now to negotiate the release of Alan Pope, who was responsible for bombing Indonesia and is now in prison. And while he's flying through, you can meet with Robert Kennedy. So Diokno meets with Bobby Kennedy, and Bobby Kennedy says, yeah, we need you to arrest Harry Stonehill, but don't tell Macapagal. And so Diokno does. And Macapagal finds out when it breaks across the press. As a result of this, long story short, and yes, I did just want to tell this story. Long story short, Macapagal has for about a year a complete falling out with the United States. Washington's boy becomes a staunch anti-colonialist for about 1 year. It's a very critical year, from 1962 to 1963. It wasn't just the personal effrontery of this. It was the fact that as a result of Harry Stonehill saying, don't let any tobacco in, Macapagal didn't let the tobacco in from the United States. The US Tobacco, who they own, a number of legislators in the United States, said, you let that tobacco in or we're not going to pay you any war credits for the damages that were caused during World War II, which was perhaps the most important piece of legislation in the United States in the eyes of the Philippines. And they did. They succeeded in blocking payment to Filipino veterans of World War II because tobacco wasn't allowed into the country. So because of this falling out over Harry Stonehill, there was a brief period of independence. Macapagal said, you know how July 4 is Philippine Independence Day? That's Philippine-American Friendship Day. Independence Day is June 12th. That's when we declared our independence from Spain. That's our Independence Day. And you know how we wear Americana, that is to say a suit and tie? We're not going to wear that anymore. Formal attire is now the Barong Tagalog. In many ways, these are very superficial nationalist measures, right? You're changing your shirts, you're changing your dates. But they indicated a certain shift. And it is in this period, looking to present himself as the continuator of what he called the unfinished revolution, and beginning to secure support from the newly reborn Partido Comunista ng Pilipinas, the Philippine Communist Party, despite the fact that Macapagal himself was a diehard anti-communist. Because he was presenting himself as an anti-imperialist, he began to ally with the other figure in the region who put forward similar rhetoric, Sukarno. And in fact, they used the same language. Macapagal began to speak of the neo-colonial forces and so on. He began to speak of newly emerging forces. He began to speak of the need to carry out an unfinished revolution.